Alright, so a DBD developer responded to Otzdarva's video saying buffing Decisive Strike is a bad idea. And this is a really good video from Otzdarva. He made some really solid points about how changing it from 3 to 5 seconds won't change too much. It's just going to hurt the lower tier killers worse, and it's going to do nothing to Nurse and Blight because they'll catch up instantly and down you. And he was also talking about how good the perk is at a comp level and in the hands of good survivors anyways. And the fact that it's, you know, a paid for perk, so he was thinking that maybe it could be worked into like a general perk for every survivor, all which were some solid points. And then he also suggests the idea of it disabling killer powers like, you know, Nurse and Blight. But here's where the DBD dev responds to him, and I think this is actually a really good response that I really didn't consider. So this is from Peanuts. First, I just want to make it absolutely clear that this is not intended to solve tunneling. This change is solely to make the perk provide more consistent value when it activates, not bring an end to the tunneling playstyle entirely. Which, you know, is kind of obvious because it's only a one-time use thing and you can't do a lot of stuff when using it. I wouldn't recommend approaching this with that idea that it'll end tunneling entirely, as that is not the purpose behind the change. You'd be setting yourself up for disappointment. Secondly, regarding disabling killers' powers, I see this get suggested a lot, but this is not an option. It's one of those things that sounds really simple on paper, but once you start drilling down into it, it turns out to be a whole can of worms. Each killer power works differently from one another, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution that applies to all of them. Each killer power would need to be considered on a case-by-case basis to determine what should happen when they're disabled. For example, if you disable the killer's power button to stop the nurse from blinking, there are multiple killers who may already have traps set around the map. Would these traps need to then be disabled? Which is a good point, because if Trapper has 4 traps in basement and you Decisive Strike, can everybody run through his traps for the next 5 seconds free of charge, or what? Like, that's definitely something to consider, you know? Or are they okay since they were already there? Some killers also have passive powers mechanics such as the Cenobite's Chain Hunt, which would also need to be considered. It would also limit the possibility for future killers' powers, since we would always need to worry, but how would it work if it was disabled by this one specific perk? To be frank, this would be unsuitable. With just over 30 killers in the game and more on the way, having special conditions for each one would require far too much ongoing support just to make that condition feasible. To give a real example from the past, the original version of Tinkerer used to increase the effectiveness of all charge speed add-ons. Even with only a handful of killers in the game at the time, it ended up being very confusing for players to keep track of which add-ons it could affect. A nightmare to balance because add-ons could either be too strong or too weak without it, and an unreasonable amount of work to upkeep as the game grew. In the same way, this would require a bit of additional work to be done for every killer just to support one perk. It's one of the reasons why the perks don't typically interact with powers, and the few that do, we're gradually moving away from, e.g. adrenaline waking up survivors. Don't get me wrong, it's a neat idea and the intention behind it is good, but it's way outside the scope for a single perk and could quickly turn into a confusing mess. Which I agree, there's so much variation between the killer powers, you know, not all killers are the same. There's no reason that the nurse's power should be disabled and the trapper's power be disabled, you know what I mean? And even so, the nurse, when her power is disabled, she's moving at, what, 3.86? So she's way slow. She's moving at like 80% movement speed. So, you know, if she's stunned for 5 seconds and then she can't use her power for 10 seconds, well, that's basically a 15-second Decisive Strike if you think about it. And then Trapper and Michael Myers and Freddy just aren't good enough to have their powers shut down at all. They're just nowhere near strong enough to have that happen, you know? And yeah, I think this was a really good response. I was honestly not expecting a response to it at all, but this was a really great response that I never even considered the possibility of. And yeah, that does it for this one. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe to that good stuff. I'll see you guys in the next one.